Since 2013, a large part of her research and many of the articles that she's written in the newsletter for the county and so forth, or for the public library in Boone County, have been about documenting the Underground Railroad history here in Boone County. And that is a fairly, well, I'll speak from my experience. When I was in high school, history didn't dare go. The history books never went into the participation in the Civil War by our black community members. Thank God, Hillary and others have been pursuing that history and creating a genealogy database. So before I go too far over babbling, Hillary, thank you for coming. Let's give her a big welcome.
I see so many familiar faces. It's nice to be with the friendly crowd. Thank you all for coming. I'm going to move up here so that I can advance this presentation a little bit easier. Betsy did such a nice job of talking about what I've been working on. I work on a lot of different things at the library involving Boone County history, but I like a challenge. And so this has been a great topic for me. If there are any Civil War buffs out there, you know more than I do. I just want you to know that right now. That's my disclaimer, because I came to this particular topic through another arena of research. I was trying to find information on all these people who grew up here and lived here who were enslaved and there are no records for. And so what the goal is to build an information database so that people who don't have the advantage that a lot of us have of being able to find records that go backwards beyond 1870, that they will have something that they can look for, at least locally. And so I've been trying to tap all the resources I could find, and I do look at military records frequently because, of course, we had it was called the United States Colored Troops, so the African Americans that served in the Civil War. There was a draft, and for the most part, the enslaved members of the community here that joined up went about it in a couple different ways. They either had run away and joined elsewhere, or they left temporarily and joined locally and never went back, or they were given permission. And in some cases, I know it's a very complicated topic, but in some cases, if the slaveholder was very firm supporter of the Union, that doesn't mean that they didn't own slaves, right? And so, that being said, in a lot of cases, that person who's the slaveholder might ask the enslaved person if they want to serve, or tell them they need to go serve, or if there is a substitute that's needed for someone in the household who doesn't want to or can't serve, then they would ask the slave to do it or tell them to do it. And so we had these instances where people who had been enslaved their whole lives were joining up to fight. And so this is why I started looking in these records, and I realized fairly recently that what a group of records that we thought we had tapped out actually held a whole lot more information. And you'll see what I'm talking about here, but we're getting a little spoiled with all the digitized records that we have access to. It's a lot easier than going to the courthouse, isn't it? But that a lot of those records have not yet been indexed. And so maybe they started to index the records. So I got a couple of hits within this one particular regiment that I'll talk about. And we only had a handful of people that we know served there through finding pension records or through this index entry. And since that point, I'm up to over 200 now. So it's a page-by-page process. I do have some helpers here and there who are able to look at it. if you love history, it's not a chore for me because I kind of like to read it, but you do have to really want to do it to look at those records. But I'll talk about how this came about and what I found. So it's really a lot about the records and the kind of the secrets that they hold. So some of the things that I'm looking for, obviously, are things like name, age, place of birth. When I look through these records, a lot of times the person might have been born in another place, but they're living in Boone County. So I'm putting them down, because if they ever touched ground here, then that means that they lived here at some point, and it might be of interest to someone in the future. There's a physical description. If you've ever seen any of those enlistment cards, it'll say, 5'9", brown hair, brown eyes, something like that. Place of enlistment is also of interest to me because of the Underground Railroad work that I do. In some cases, I'll see somebody from Boone County and they're enlisting in Michigan. How'd that happen? So either, it's just a couple options. If they were born in Boone County before the end of 1865, they were most likely born enslaved. And I'll show you an example of that. So it could mean that they either were manumitted or emancipated, or they ran. So that always piques my interest and makes me want to look a little harder at them. You'll see the name of the slaveholder on some of the records, which was a huge thing, because we have had descendants of enslaved people from Boone County come here. One of the big things that they want to know is, where were they? They want to know the ground they walked on, right? They want to know the piece of property. And so that's important to people. And so if we can identify that slaveholder, and a lot of times the name did carry through the family history, and so they may even know that name already. Some of these records will show a change in location, like I'm talking about someone enlisting in Michigan, or perhaps in the Deep South. And the Deep South would indicate that someone was sold south. If they say they were born in Boone County, I intuit from that they know that they were born in Boone County, which means that they were cognizant of that, which means they were at least a few years old or more, right? They knew that history. So I take all these little nuggets out of there and try to build a story around this person. It also has the traditional information that you would find, like the service history, the rank, the duties. One of the people that I found in the records was from, he had the same name. He didn't have a slaveholder's name, but he had the same name as a family that was in Boone County for many, many years, and some still are, and they're horse people. And his job was an ambulance driver. And if any of you all have ever ridden a horse or been near a horse, you will understand that driving a team of horses onto a battlefield is a pretty high-level skill. And so I thought that was interesting simply because I recognized the name as being the name of a family who had horses. And it would make sense that someone who was enslaved to them would be working the horses too. So it's kind of interesting. You do find some family and personal information in some of these records. It may be, in the sad case that someone has died, there will be some information about a wife or a child or someone that they have left as contact. There are, in very few cases, some letters that have been written either by them or on their behalf. There's illness and injury, death, of course, and in very few but very interesting cases, burial location, which is really a neat thing. If you have ever been a cemetery hunter looking for people and where they're buried, you understand how important that is. So just as a quick overview, there were nearly 200,000 people who enlisted in the United States Colored Troops, which was the African American Army. They were separate regiments, they were segregated. Of those, 40,000 were casualties. We also had 20,000 African American sailors serving for the Union. And so when the rivers, the western rivers, became, active in the war, then these men would enlist, and that was interesting because they were integrated. They were on a boat. 20 to 25% of those that served especially in that theater on the western rivers, were African American. So that's a fourth. That's quite a bit. And of all of the troops that served that were African American, there are 25 identified Medal of Honor recipients. And I say identified because some of these records are still being combed through, and they're trying to identify people. In the Navy records, which I don't focus on as much because I'm still learning my way around, all you can really use to identify if a person is African American is the description, the physical description. It's rare that they will list that this person was enslaved. Once in a blue moon, but fairly rare. So as I said, to date we have been able to find over 200 formerly enslaved men from Boone County. So they've been identified. In the Kentucky, if we narrow it down to Kentucky, we played a huge role in the manning of the United States colored troops. There were many, many regiments. They're listed here, but you can see, we had infantry, we had cavalry, we had artillery, heavy and light. We had a huge presence in the colored troops as a state. So Kentucky ranks right up there at the top. I have seen several sources that say that we contributed the most men to the United States colored troops, but Louisiana claims that too. So, I like a challenge, we'll see. I think part of that is, depending on what you're looking at, because we had so much river border, and we had, all these free states right across the river, people would just cross the river and go enlist. They're still from Kentucky. I don't know if they're counting that or not, but I think we win. I put this Camp Nelson poster up there. There were many examples of this, and this is an example of the kind of enthusiasm that was being generated, and offering of a bounty, of course, was a nice thing, but getting paid and getting fed, and you're working, but you're working for money, so that's a new thing and very tempting. So obviously a lot of enslaved people couldn't read, but they threw enough of these around, somebody would read it to them, somebody would show them. And this photo down here, the 107th Infantry, we did have some soldiers, and that just frustrates me to no end when I see something that I think might be somebody that I've looked at their records, but those were some of the men that were serving after the draft. So Camp Nelson, have you all been to Camp Nelson or heard of Camp Nelson? For the purposes of this study, Camp Nelson was being used sort of as a housing area for enslaved men who the Union Army went and gathered them up. This is before they were serving as soldiers, and asked for and just took them really, and had them help build railroads for the Union Army. And so that they were sort of housing them there in these dormitory situations. And then when the draft happened and it became official that they were going to be serving, Camp Nelson became sort of home base for all the Kentucky United States colored troops. And already it was being used as a training center and supply center for Kentucky and Tennessee. So it was a busy place. And it grew rapidly, more than they could really handle. Families would follow in a lot of cases. And we're talking about 1864. Nobody knew what was going to happen yet with the war, but in a lot of cases in these border states, people were not pursuing them when they left because things were a little chaotic. And so they left and followed the men who were coming to serve, and this huge town began to develop. And these commanders, these camp commanders didn't know what to do. They weren't prepared. There was disease. There was starvation. I mean, they really just weren't ready for all these people to just show up and say, okay, take care of us. And so they started building them little makeshift barracks and places to live. But in a lot of cases, whoever was commanding the camp would say, we can't take care of you. You're going to have to go, move on. And they would be evicted. And then who knows, So I think in a lot of cases they've come back. So finally, if you all are familiar with Fee, who started Berea College, he and some other Quakers came and started doing some missionary work, which helped a lot with that problem. They built schools, and they built some housing, and they started feeding and educating and clothing people. So that helped a great deal, and I'm sure the Union Army was really happy to have that happen. So I just put a couple little things in here. Like I said, the Navy records, I'm still learning. They're completely different than the service records that I've seen. And I'm not real sure what I'm looking at in a lot of cases, but I'm picking my way through. But I found this wonderful picture of this young man who looks to be about my son's age, honestly. He looks like a teenager. And he's a sailor. He enlisted in Cincinnati. So he could be somebody from here. Some of these guys, I'll see records once in a while, you know, slaves would sometimes be hired out, meaning you have a few days off and you can go work for this person who needs help. In a lot of cases, the slaveholder would say you can keep half the money and I get half, or however they worked it out. Because we are close to the river, a lot of times that would be working on the river. And so, surprisingly to a lot of people, because everyone assumes that someone would just run away, but if they have a family, they're not going to do that in most cases. But they would already be familiar with what's involved with working on a steamboat. And since all of the military, not all, most of the military boats going up and down the Ohio during the time of that expansion were modified steamboats, they were an asset, I'm sure. And they were doing the jobs that were the entry-level menial jobs in a lot of cases, but not always. And their rank is mentioned in a lot of the paperwork, and so you can see when someone has some skill that they enter at a higher level. They put them where their skills will be best used. All right, so now we get to the nitty-gritty of what I have found. This is one example. This man is a man that was in Connecticut when he enlisted, and that's pretty far north. So what I looked at is I looked at the information on the first few pages of the record that talks about where this man was born. And it's Boone County, Kentucky, and you really have to watch that because we know how many Boone counties there are out there. There's a physical description which is just interesting, you know. And when men enlisted in, especially after the draft, but when they enlisted, there was usually some comment that said where they were credited, because, you know, everybody had to do their part. And this man was credited to Middlesex County, Connecticut, so he was either living there or a substitute. If he was a substitute, how did he get all the way to Connecticut? So it's interesting on that level. But I looked at it from the point of view that if he was born free, then he would have had to have been born to a free woman. Well, there was no free woman who was African American in our records at the time that he was born. They weren't here. People were manumitted and freed, but they left, typically. Or they were very old when that happened. And so this is the kind of record that I will put aside and say, I need to look at this, and where did this guy come from, and is this really his name? His name's William Webster here, but that doesn't necessarily mean that was his name when he lived here. But he did identify Boone County as his place of birth. This is the 117th, excuse me, dry. The 117th was probably our most populated regiment with Boone County folks in the United States Colored Troops. 96 men enlisted from Boone County. They did enlist and muster at Covington, which makes sense. They were also at Camp Nelson for a little bit. But they were in the war at this pivotal time near the end, and all of these huge landmark things happened when the 117th was involved. So I think that's kind of an interesting thing to think about if you can put yourself back in time, which is really hard to do. But they were involved in the siege of Petersburg, right near the end, Appomattox, and Lee's surrender, and Richmond. So they chased Lee down. They were involved with that whole campaign. So that's a pretty important part of the war. I'm sorry, let me go back to that. I know these photos are kind of hard to see, but the one on the left, I got these from the National Archives, and these tents are supposed to be, they're labeled in several photographs as the bomb-proof tents. I'm not sure what that means, because I'm sure that bombs would hit them, but this was where they were living, and this is nearby. Point of Rocks Camp Hospital, and that'll feature very large in this regiment's history because Point of Rocks is an area where there was a lot of loss. I looked for it, and I used to live in Virginia, so I know that area fairly well, and I looked to see where it was, and it was not too far from Richmond, but it's in a real wet area. And so you can intuit from that it's not the easiest place to stay dry and healthy in the summer especially. So the 117th, just a little bit of their history. I did tell you some of this, but they organized in Covington, and so that's kind of why we had so many folks join this particular regiment. And then they went to Baltimore and then on to City Point. City Point is important at the end of the war. And of course they were at Petersburg and Richmond. I don't think they were, any of you know about the crater in Petersburg? Have you heard of that? There was a crater. Those were Pennsylvania miners that made that happen. It was supposed to be a trap. They were going to blow this big crater. 117th I don't think was there yet. That's one of the ones that I always think of when I think of Petersburg. That's my little bit of Civil War history that I know. But they were there right at the end, and this gentleman here is one of the men standing guard in Petersburg. It's a pretty nice photo. It's somebody with a good photographer. It's not what's the guy, Matthew? That famous Civil War photographer. It wasn't his. Brady. See, I told you. I don't know enough about the Civil War. So the Appomattox campaign right near the end in 1865. March and April. Then Petersburg fell and they chased Lee down. They were at the surrender of Lee, which I kind of decided to feature there. So they were in that area just south of Richmond for a fairly long time, spring and into late summer. And they ended up in Texas. I'm trying to find out if any of them became Buffalo soldiers, because there were some Buffalo soldiers that mustered right there in that area, and that would be interesting to know, but I haven't found them yet. So this map, I know it's hard to see from where you are, but all of that water. So there's the James River, there's the Appomattox River, and all this is wet. When the 117th showed up to this camp, General Butler was there. This star up at the top, that's Butler's headquarters. They had just gotten all the troops that were there to sort of understand. This was with probably a lot of the aid societies that came and the relief societies, and taught them how water could work for you or against you. And they were practicing these careful measures, and they had tents and everything because there was malaria, it was dysentery, all kinds of terrible things. Every time a whole new wave of new troops would come in, they'd have to retrain them. And when these guys showed up, they had to do that again. And I have to think that even though we may be talking about men who did physical labor, and they may have been physically fit in that way, they were not terribly healthy in a lot of cases, not getting enough to eat or the right types of food to eat. And so they may have been a little compromised to start with. Or they may have been enlisting when they weren't healthy enough to do so, they just wanted to go. So more than a third of the men from Boone County, that group of 96, died from disease in Virginia in this regiment. And most of the folks were at that Point of Rocks where I showed you the hospital. And I was going through them one by one, and of course they're all mixed in. And I kept seeing this Point of Rocks, and I thought, what is going on at this place? Well, I read a little something about one of the aid societies where it was in the Liberator, which was an abolitionist newspaper, and they always put the most dramatic stories they could to raise interest. Probably mostly true, but they were dramatized too. But there was a woman who had been serving in Virginia, and she was talking about the conditions and how hard it was. And so that was what it was in my mind when I was reading this about these guys who all died there. And it's sad to me because the ones who really wanted to get into the fight didn't make it. This gentleman, he's my favorite. He's got that hat. So this guy, his name is Edmund Delaney, and that's not why I picked him. We did have Delaney's here in Boone County. My husband is not one of them, so there's no connection that I know of there, not a close one anyway. But this gentleman was featured in a blog post by someone in the National Archives who was talking about this collection and what could be found. And his file is a unique case. He was in Kentucky. He was in Bourbon County. And we had a lot of families that we were connected to in Bourbon County, a lot of the same family names. So Delaney's were here, and that was interesting to me, but his slaveholder name was Graves. And if you're from Boone County, you know that we have a lot of those. So I started to look. I think they are connected, but kind of distantly, but the fact that he was a Delaney and there weren't very many Delaneys in Bourbon County made me think that maybe he came from Boone County. But he was kind of a sharp-looking guy, and there are letters in his file, and there are letters to the slaveholder, which is also interesting and complicated. But it's a sweet sort of general letter at the beginning, and he talks about, you know, I'm doing well, and I'd like to hear how you are doing, give my respects to the family. Then he said, I think you have slighted me a good deal, as I have never received a letter from you since I have come into the service. He's a little lonely. And then he gives more respects to various friends and neighbors, and he says, please answer this letter as soon as you get it and tell me how you're all getting along. So that's the second plea for a letter. More greetings to friends and neighbors, and also to my father-in-law and his wife. I wish you would write to my wife and find out why she don't write me. This poor guy is not getting any mail. So he did make it through the war. You'll be glad to hear. And he wrote a couple of letters, and I think that's just fascinating to see that. And so, though he's not from Boone County, I wanted to share that with you all because I thought it was so interesting to know that he was corresponding with them. The sold south phrase, I'm sure you've all heard that, and sold down the river, and it's literal. This guy was in a different set of records that I just came across, and I'm not familiar with the name Dansel, so I'm not exactly sure where that comes from. But he was born in Boone County, and he enlisted at Natchez. And what was on the record that I found so interesting was that he was listed as being from Stewart's plantation in Wilkinson. And so they listed a whole lot for me to go on. Stewart's plantation in Wilkinson County, Mississippi is pretty specific. And so I went looking for it, and I was lucky enough to find a picture. And this is a recent picture that, it's kind of the standard southern postcard kind of, it's beautiful. I found several pictures of that property. It has been restored. It was in disrepair, and it was kind of sad. Those pictures were sad. But this family, Duncan Stewart was a governor, so this was a well-known family, and probably that's why that made it onto the record, because they knew who he was. He may have been given permission to join, simply because typically if someone didn't have permission to leave, why would they tell you where they came from? The Stewart family, at the time that this man enlisted, had over 350 slaves, and so it would be next to impossible to find a reference to him unless there were family papers somewhere, and there may be. But Natchez is so close to Wilkinson County, and Natchez had a huge slave market, and it was called the Crossroads. And we had slave traders working in Boone County, from Boone County, and Louisville, who regularly went to Natchez to trade. And so it stands to reason that that may be how he got there. In most cases, it was an economic decision, because Kentucky, and it's particularly in Boone County, I don't think I've ever seen a slaveholder here with more than, I think the largest group I've ever seen is over 30, but that was a woman who came from Maryland and dispersed some of her slaves pretty soon after. Because of our hills and the way that our property is, you don't have those giant farms. And so most people would not have more than 10 enslaved people. And so people being people, they have babies, and then you have too many and you can't afford it, or you have a financial downturn, and that's when people get sold, or someone tries to run away. There are many reasons, but we see this, we see people disappear from the records a lot, but we don't see them show up somewhere else. So it's really an interesting thing to find, especially specific property where this man ended up. He didn't stay in service. He took this opportunity to emancipate himself. So he deserted May 7th. He enlisted, I think it looks like February, and said, this is not for me. He stayed long enough to decide it wasn't for him. The aid societies played a huge role, specifically with the United States Colored Troops, because in a lot of cases you're talking about people who had one job, lived in one place their whole lives. And there may be some need for the aid societies more in those groups than in other groups, just for the sheer need of writing letters, if nothing else, because most people were not literate. And so I picked this one because it was pretty specific, and it was a Boone County person, and this was the United States Christian Commission, who did a lot of work with a lot of the troops, all of the regiments, not just the United States Colored Troops, but they were helping this soldier because he wasn't getting his bounty. And so they were writing letters. It was a petition to get paid. And so can you imagine doing everything that you had to do as a soldier and then not getting paid? So that's a great service. They also did things like they brought food and medical services, and like I said, they taught soldiers, from all over how to stay healthy and how to take care of themselves. This photograph didn't come from the records. It's just a photograph from the archives, but that's a soldier and his family. I put that here because one of these letters that was included in the service records was written by this lieutenant, and he was writing on behalf of one of his soldiers, and he was really, I labeled it civil rights. I didn't know what else to call it, because at the time that this man wrote this letter on behalf of the soldier, the man's family was still enslaved and they weren't supposed to be. And that happened frequently. I mean, how would you know? I mean, if nobody told you and nobody forced that person to free those people, how would they know? And so he writes this letter on his behalf and cites this act of Congress. So it's really not an entreaty as much as it's sort of a, you better do this. And the fact that the officers were so personally involved in this situation is interesting to me, because you have a lot of people serving. So either this man was persistent and said, you need to help me, or this lieutenant was a good guy and went around and helped as much as he could. And so we see this happen once in a while. There's a case in Boone County where a man who served, his name was Henry Bishop, and he came back from service and went directly to the law and said, you need to get my family back. And his family was enslaved in Florence, and 2 different slaveholders, and so he was petitioning to have them released, and his petition didn't work. Even though the law was on his side, there were some nuances there. They eventually were freed. And I did see them together as a family, but it took a lot of work, and he had a lot of help. He had some good lawyers on his side that was in the newspapers, but he couldn't get them out of the hands of these guys until after the end of December, of 1865. This is the thing that I printed, because obviously you cannot read that from there. Slave compensation claims. So slaveholders have these people that they are essentially, in some cases, being compelled to give up for the fight, and this is their property, right, by law. And so because Lincoln had done quite a bit of tap dancing with the border states and trying to keep them on board, made a lot of promises to the border states, saying, you stay with the Union, we won't take your stuff, we won't make you give up your slaves, and then they came and asked them. And so they had to make a lot of promises and a lot of concessions. One of the things that they did offer was, here are this is one route you can go. If your enslaved person was drafted, you can fill out a form and go through the motions of swearing your allegiance to the Union and giving us all the information that we need to prove that you are the person that you say you are, then you will be compensated for your contribution to the war effort. And so this was actually filed after the war, and I think that was the case with a lot of folks. This one was filed in 1867, and it's done, it's notarized and witnessed, and There were affidavits given to prove that this man owned this enslaved person. Their name was Webb, and there are still Webbs in Boone County, and this man did return to Boone County after the war, the enslaved man that served. What I don't know yet, and I find it kind of interesting, I hope I find the answer, is did they get paid? I didn't ever see any receipt that said paid in full or how much, but just the fact that they had to go through this process, they had to have their attorney, you know. But these records, for my purposes, were very interesting for the research because there was a chain of ownership that was sometimes required. In the case of Peter Webb, the slaveholder states and has a witness that will back him up that says, I owned Peter Webb's mother, and I've owned him since he was born. In other cases, there are things that say, I bought him from John Smith on this day in this town. And that's, there you go, there's another piece of the puzzle that falls into place because of these records. So they really hold a lot of information that otherwise we wouldn't know, so they're helpful. The burial location is not real common. I'm sure that there were many, many soldiers in this war that were buried where they fell, many. And that's why we have all these unknown soldier graves, etc. I think in the case of the USDT, they were not given they were just in a different social strata. I think that there were people who cared. I think that there were lots of people who cared, but it was an overwhelming war as well. So I think in the case of this man, and I've seen a couple that were buried in this location, so this must have been an impromptu burial ground, but it's fairly specific. It's near East Butler's headquarters, and on that map that I showed you, that's where they were, but Turner's house. So really it's a matter of finding out where Turner lived in regards to Butler's headquarters, and that's where the cemetery was. Now what we don't know is whether or not anything was marked, whether it's been recognized. I don't know that yet. I may try to find that, but this was something that was given to the military by the Christian Commission, again, another one of those aid societies, who found it important and said we need to document where these men are buried. And so on the military record, because it's the military and they do everything, you know, they document like crazy, thankfully. They say that this is not an official record, but they put it in there, which is great, you know. And I haven't thumbed through all of the record sets outside of the colored troops in the same way. I look for specific people once in a while, but not in this way. And I wonder if there's the same amount of information. It would be different information, but that would certainly be something I'd look for, is if you don't know what happened to this person. And I know I have a couple of those in my family history that I have no idea. So that would be a good place to start. Here in Kentucky, there is a monument that was dedicated in 1924, and this was by the Women's Relief Corps of the Grand Army of the Republic. And they were African American. This is in an African American cemetery in Frankfort. There are 142 soldiers' names on this, and this is the only monument of its kind in Kentucky, meaning this is the official Grand Army of the Republic monument, right? There are several others that I found since then that are sort of group monuments like this. These were not necessarily men from the same regiments. They were all from sort of central Kentucky. So I haven't gone through the names to see if there's anybody connected to us. But it's Frankfort, so it's not too terribly far away. And it's a nice memorial. And so I thought I would end with that because it has sort of a positive ending to that, there being memorialized like that. I know that's a lot of information, but I did present this once before, and I had someone ask me if you could find the same things in all the records. So if you are looking in Civil War records, you can get to this information through Fold 3. There's a direct path in Fold 3 that I will say that there are some states, you can go state by state and choose what state you're looking in, and then what regiment, and it just kind of goes from there. Some of them would be indexed, but some of the states don't have the record availability yet digitized. Ohio is one of them, which is kind of frustrating. But there are a lot of individual websites out there that have the same kind of information. But it is kind of fun to thumb through because you might run across things like letters and pictures. Does anybody have a question about all that information? I just laid on you. Yes, ma'am.
I had one thing, you started talking to me before about what happened after the Civil War, with some of the families fighting each other.
Yes.
Everything made me interested in that.
Yeah, there was, what Ron's talking about is, we were talking about just the violence that sort of permeated society after this war. And, you know, in Boone County, and Betsy mentioned this, and I grew up here too, and we didn't know any of this. I didn't learn this at school, you know, not at the time. So when people returned from war, and they were still angry at each other, there was a lot of loss, and people were probably suffering from PTSD, and there was a lot of violence. And if you look, we have the Boone County Recorder back to 1875, so it starts 10 years after the war ends. There are so many entries of people just shooting each other all over the place, and I can't help but think that even if it doesn't say so, that's kind of related. You know, that was a time where there was a lot of violence and animosity, and that was the way people were solving whatever dispute they had. In the case of the people that returned from the Confederate forces, and I'm not saying everybody, there was a very small group who were terrorizing people. And they went directly for people who had served in the United States Colored Troops and their family members, because it was like a double gotcha for them, right? And so the Freedmen's Bureau, who was set up to help the soldiers sort of integrate into society and with their money, et cetera, and it became this huge entity that helped with African Americans right after the Civil War, way into even the turn of the century. The Freedmen's Bureau documented all of these instances, and Boone County is directly mentioned, and I was completely floored that I didn't know any of this. And there were instances of people just, you know, going after the soldier or the soldier's wife, or, you know, and so what happened, obviously, is people left in great number. And so that's sort of the history of who stayed and who went. A lot of it had to do with their service, because there were people coming back from war who were very angry about them being freed, for one thing, and fighting against them and taking up arms. And so that was a really, really significant beef that they had. And it occurred, it seemed, in the same general area. A lot of times they didn't name the names, but I think the geography lens sort of leads me to the conclusion that this was a group of people that were focused on this. There were a lot of people, like in Burlington and Florence, it wasn't happening as much. It was out in the country where it was easier for people to go in and be nasty and leave and not get caught. So, but yeah, that was one hangover thing from the war that was happening here that relates to those families. Any other questions? Tom?
The one that was born in Boone County and enlisted in Natchez,
Yeah.
I couldn't see, what was the date?
When he enlisted, it was February, and you know, I think it was earlier. I think it was more like 1863, and this was pre-draft, which also makes me think he must have had permission. The Stewart family, although they were slaveholders, they were from the Northeast originally, and they settled in Mississippi. I think that their patriarch had some kind of land given to him there. But I believe it was February 11th, and I think it was as early as 1863, and then he took off in a couple of months. So, let's see. It looks like it doesn't have the, oh wait. I think it was 1864, but pre-draft. Pre-draft 1864, early 1864. And this man was 40. So, especially for enslaved people, that's getting up there, if you can believe that. I think that's young. But he, you know, he typically would have entered service either not up to the task or in charge of a few people. Those are the two categories. If you're probably 40 and over, you're either in a leadership position or you're kind of falling behind a little bit. So, yeah. Anyone else have a question? Yes, ma'am.
When I was younger, my grandparents owned a house in Ludlow, and they kept telling the story over and over about a tunnel that went from their basement
Mm-hmm.
down to the river.
Mm-hmm.
Do we know if that is true?
If the tunnel existed, or if it was
So apparently,
Underground
my parents
Railroad?
saw it.
Oh, I'm sure it did. There were lots of people who had the tunnels that were originally, made it easier to bring things in and out to the river because that was the highway, and that makes sense. But yes, the tunnel, the whole image of the tunnel as an escape route, I think a lot of times they were used that way depending on who was living in the house. But also I think from the other end, people would just hide, just run and, 'cause most people would flock to the river and try to figure out how to get across. And you got to hide somewhere if someone is nearby. Where was the house in Ludlow? Do you know where?
On Forest,
Okay.
across the street from Mrs. Thomas.
Is it that big house that's still there? I'm trying to
It's
think.
still there.
Yeah.
I was just wondering if anybody cared about the fact that they're.
Oh, well, I did some research on a man named Israel Evans who lived in a house in Ludlow. And I don't know if it's the same house, but I would love to know more. I will take your information because in the case of the Evans house, and it was there before he got there, but he was definitely from an abolitionist family. So the rumors played out. I mean, his family was in Highland County, Ohio, and they were actively helping people. And it's documented, from the turn of the century forward. So it's been talked about for many, many years, but we didn't make the connection here, or it just remained family stories maybe in a lot of cases. And I think kids get really interested in that when there's a tunnel involved, and then nobody, thinks to pursue it too far from there. But now people are really looking at it again, and
And we did an underground railroad tour several years ago. Down in Covington, there were several houses right on Riverside Drive there,
Mm-hmm.
and they had the tunnels.
Sure.
One of the people that lived in the house, we went through, there was a tour of their house. They had no idea, they didn't even realize the significance
Oh, sure.
of that tunnel
Right.
going out under their yard and
Sure.
out right to the riverbank.
Right.
They weren't, I guess, thinking about that.
Right. Well, and a lot of those houses did have them, and they weren't used that way. But certainly they could be, and especially right where the Licking is, because a lot of people followed the Licking to get to the Ohio.
That's Cornell House in Covington.
Yeah.
Tunnel goes out to the Licking River.
Yeah.
And the house at 242nd Street that I owned had a tunnel
Did it?
going out from the sub-basement
Oh, yeah.
to the Licking River, which collapsed during
Oh, gosh.
the 37 flood, I believe.
Yeah.
And so the
That's
only
interesting.
head was below the basement part.
Oh,
that hadn't
sure.
collapsed.
Wow. Yeah, those are all, when I hear these stories from people, I always follow up because it really does lead somewhere sometimes, or sometimes we understand why it may have been a place where people hid but may not have come from the house
Right.
in some cases. And then there are some legends like Holmes High School. That one's not true, although I wanted it to be, but it's not true. There's a lot of legends surrounding Holmes High School as being an Underground Railroad stop, but no, I don't think so. But yeah, so that's really interesting. I love hearing those stories. Thank you all for sharing those. Does anybody else have a question or a hint for me? No? All right, well, thank you all so much for giving me your time.